Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Another video for you. So much happening, so much to try to keep up with. Hope you're enjoying these videos. I'm going to do my best to jam a lot of information into a very short amount of time. But as always, I will probably fail miserably at keeping it at 15 minutes, and I will probably push 20 minutes. And at that point, I will say, boy, I don't have any more time. So if you want more information, if you want more analysis, please go to the Patreon page, patreon.com/Eric Draitzer. Anything that I can't get to in one of these videos that I plan to from this handy little notepad here, well, then that will go into the other videos that'll be up on the Patreon. So thank you for those of you who are already supporting and those of you considering it. Okay, let's talk about economics because of economics really is I think it's the issue of the day today here on March 3rd. I'm recording. It is March 3rd at 8:30 in the evening here on the East Coast in the United States, and economic collapse is happening. I mean, this is a disaster in Russia, and despite any spin, despite any attempts to suggest that the Russians are going to be able to very easily navigate through all of this is totally bogus. This is a disaster scenario. I'm going to talk about some of the economic data and just to kind of illustrate some of the points that I've been making about just how dangerous the situation is for Russia and for Russian people. Up until this point, I had talked about things like inflation, loss of purchasing power, gap between rich and poor, and the social implications of all of that. I mean, all of these very sort of almost you could say institutionalized inequalities and problems within the Russian economy. All of that is really secondary now to what we're witnessing, which is almost an overnight collapse and destruction of the Russian economy. And what does that look like? Well, for one thing, it looks like the major Russian stocks, like their energy companies and banks and others, being essentially reduced to penny stocks. I've already talked about British, BP pulling out of Rosneft and other major investors pulling out of these companies, sending their values into the toilet. But it's really not about stock prices. It's not about any of that. It's about the actual real economy. So let's talk about the real economy. And I will just say that a lot of this data I pulled from a very good article that I found in the Russian press. I tweeted it out. If you're following me on Twitter, you can find it. I believe it was from Novaya Gazeta. But in any case, I'm just going to kind of go through some of the economic data to give you a sense of the real impact here, because I think that that is not really fully understood even by the mainstream press in the United States and in the West. I mean, they talk about oil and gas sales, they talk about oligarchs and massive multi-million dollar yachts and things like this, but they don't get into the nuts and bolts of Russian economy. And I think that's what we need to do in order to understand just how wide reaching this disaster is. So as of 2021, the total exports for Russia were roughly 544 billion US dollars. Okay, now of that 544, half goes to Europe and the US. And of that, I mean, really, the US makes up very little. The US only makes up roughly 4% of all of Russia's exports. So, in other words, the primary export market, the market that really makes or breaks the Russian economy, it is Europe. And as we know, the sanctions that have been put in place are wide reaching and cut very, very deep. And Europe is simply not going to be the market for Russia anymore. How do you replace 50% of your exports overnight? It's not possible. Let's talk a little bit further. Russia sells to Europe. Russia sells gas to Europe. 60% of Russian gas exports go to Europe. 60%. I mean, it's actually, I think it's a little more than 60%. So almost two-thirds of their total gas exports going to Europe. That is coming to an end. How do you replace that? You cannot. 50% of all petroleum exports, that's not just gas, but all petroleum exports from Russia go to Europe. Okay. Think about the scale of what we're talking about. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. Okay. So now 35%, and it's not just energy, 35% of Russia's aluminum exports, which is a huge chunk, goes to Europe. 30% of their coal exports goes to Europe. Okay, now, if you consider what Europe means for Russia and what the European market means for Russian capital, well, then you get a pretty good sense of just how dangerous this territory is now, because this could have, not just knock on effects. I mean, this would fundamentally, and it is fundamentally altering and, in fact, destroying the Russian economy. China, right? So now let's think about China, right? The idea of China as coming in to sort of replace Europe in the Russian, economic formula, right? This has been talked about. This is Dugin's wet dream, right? The Eurasian, integration where Russia and China ally against the West, the decadent, liberal, transgendered West, or whatever nonsense these Russian fascists like to say. Um, the truth is that China is actually much less of a partner for Russia than Europe is. And despite all of the, sort of, wild talk from Eurasianists and anti-US voices, the reality is that China doesn't come close to replacing what Russia's losing when it loses Europe. So let's talk a little bit about that. half half of what the EU buys, half of what the EU buys is excuse me, sorry. China buys 50% of Russian timber exports. China buys half, actually less than half of what the EU buys from Russia. So the idea that this 1.5 billion person country would somehow replace a much smaller European Union, it's not true, at least not economically, at least not what the data shows. Half of the EU total, that's what goes to China. So, how do you make it up? I'm not sure that you can. 50% of the timber. The Russia China business, the Russia China trade, this is made up in dollars. How does Russia and China continue trade at the same levels if they can't access those dollars? Or Russia can't access the dollars, right? This is part of the problem for Russia. I'm going to talk about the need for cash, why Russia needs cash, and how is Russia going to settle this? They settle right now, they settle I think it's less than 10% of all debts between them in rubles and yuan, or maybe it's 20%. I'm not sure, but it's a low number. Now, of course, that number is going to go up. Everybody, all of the Kremlin sycophants love to talk about de-dollarization. De-dollarization. Give me a break. These people don't understand the first thing about global economic system, about how it works, about how the reserve currency, the dollar, operates, why the US Treasuries market, as vast as it is integral to the functioning of the global economy, why whenever there are conflicts, people come rushing back into the US dollar because of the stability that it provides, etc. I mean, I could go on and point to 100 different reasons why the notion of de-dollarization is more of a propaganda tool than it is anything else. Of course, we would love to see the world moving away from the US dollar. The dollar is what allows for the imperial hegemony of the United States. It is what keeps this empire running. It is is probably the primary lever that the US has to maintain its power, even more than its military, as we see right now. So the idea of de-dollarization is mostly ludicrous. The idea of building an alternative system to SWIFT, I know it's happening, but does that solve the problems in the near term, in the medium term? No, it does not. Russia is, I mean, to use a sort of asinine phrase, Russia is really truly between a rock and a hard place here. So they're going to have to figure out how to do their trade without dollars. They're going to have to figure out how to substitute for a lot of different things. And I'm going to get to all of the imports and all of the brands and stuff in a second, because that is going to have social and cultural impacts in the in the body politic in Russia, in the among the Russian masses. So now let's talk about what the EU sells to Russia, right? Because it's not like a, colonial trade or something. It's not just, raw materials coming out of Russia and that's it, like a colony or something. There's a lot of trade that goes back and forth. The EU sells roughly 40% of all Russian imports. So if you take everything that Russia imports, 40% of it comes right out of the European Union. We're talking nearly $400 billion. $400 billion. Now, that is absolutely in danger. It is in very serious jeopardy, and I'm not exactly sure what that means. I'm not sure how they're going to substitute that. Oh, excuse me, I misspoke. It's 40% from the EU, the UK, and the US combined. Sorry, 40% from the EU, UK, and US, all of whom have cut Russia off. Okay, so ultimately it amounts to the same thing. That where are they going to find the other, the 40% of their imports? They can't go to these markets. They can't go to these companies, right? So now where do they focus these imports? It is primarily machinery. It is various mechanisms for large scale and complex machine tools, and vehicles, both personal vehicles and cars, automobiles, and stuff, but other vehicles as well. The engines for those vehicles, etc. The main suppliers are European. I mean, these are European companies, whether it's medical instruments or oil refinery equipment or whatever, right? These type of things Russia imports. So now that it can't import them, where are they supposed to come from? You can't just pull them out of thin air. Somebody's got to make things, right? But one of the problems for Russia is that they don't make these things. It's been, well, I mean, at least several generations really since the Russians had to make these things on their own. So now you're talking about a country that desperately needs to continue being able to export, but in order to export, it needs to be able to import the tools and the supplies and the parts. They're not going to be able to get the parts to service their airplanes. They're not going to be able to get the parts to keep their software running, their computer hardware running, all kinds of things that they're not going to be able to do, or at the very least, not going to be able to do very easily. It's going to make life very difficult, and both in terms of everyday life but business life as well. And the business life, the economic life of Russia, obviously, obviously, is going to translate into a politically unstable situation. If the economy collapses, the political situation basically also begins to collapse, and that is very worrying. It is very dangerous when we're talking about a country like this. Okay, the I said machine tools, microprocessors, all of these kind of things. So basically, what is this coming to? This is coming to the fact that Russia needs China a hell of a lot more than China needs Russia. And Russia needs the EU a hell of a lot more than the EU needs Russia. Unfortunately for Putin, that is what we're seeing playing out in real time. This may not have been something people would have believed 5 years ago or even 5 weeks ago, but believe it because it's happening. So now, in thinking about China's role in the China Russia trade, China buys about 14% of Russian exports, and it provides about 24% of Russian imports. So, in other words, there's a trade imbalance. Russia imports way more from China than it exports to China. Now, of course, as the energy trade shifts more in that direction and other things, then yes, those numbers will probably even out a little bit. But ultimately, you still are going to have a trade imbalance. Two-thirds. Now, think about what comes into Russia from China. Two-thirds of all mobile phones, 60% of electronics imports, right? Now China is going to essentially have a monopoly over Russia. They know that Russia is not going to be able to go to the Europeans to buy their cell phones or whatever. They're going to be forced to buy Huawei products or whatever it might be, right? So now China's got Russia over a barrel, and this is exactly what the United States would love. Right. The idea that Russia and China's so-called alliance is fraying as Russia is made into this kind of subordinate secondary player, basically, right? And that doesn't do much for Putin's ego. It certainly doesn't do much for the Russian security state. I think the relationship will remain tense. Russia buys a grand total of 2%, 2% of Chinese exports. So China is obviously the manufacturing, one of the manufacturing centers of the world. Their exports are huge, and Russia makes up a drop in that bucket. Now, in terms of the imports that China gets, 3% come from Russia. So in terms of China's exports, 2% and imports 3%. In other words, Russia doesn't mean a hell of a whole lot to the Chinese economy. And that is something that the various Kremlin propagandists and so forth will just be apoplectic over, that I dare to even suggest that Russia is kind of a joke when it comes to China and economics. All right, let's talk quickly about some brands that are no longer going to be available in Russia, and why that matters. Apple is gone. So if the iPads and the laptops and the iPhones and all of that, that's going to be a big problem, especially for young people who are already extremely discontented with what is happening. How about Spotify and Netflix and all of these things? These are going to hit people in a cultural sense, right? It's going to hit them in their everyday lives. They're not going to be able to ignore the war in Ukraine, because the war in Ukraine is the reason they can't stream the latest Lana Del Rey record or whatever it might be. I don't know why I picked Lana Del Rey of all people. Yeah, but the point is that these services are gone for Russians. How about Boeing and Airbus? Both companies freezing the Russians out. How are the Russian airlines supposed to continue operating? How are Russian airplanes supposed to be fixed if they can't get the parts? How about Intel and AMD, both the microprocessor manufacturers? They're now out in Russia. How are the computers going to get built? How are the computers going to continue to run? Same for Oracle with software. How are Russian businesses supposed to keep working if the software becomes outdated and unsupportable? I mean, again, anybody who's worked in the professional world knows. I mean, these are sort of the rudimentary things that are required to conduct business in the modern world. You can't just substitute the software. You can't just make it up. So that's a big, big, big problem. Of course, like I said, computers, cars as well. Cars have computers as well. So a lot, and it's many different brands: Mercedes, BMW, Land Rover, and on and on and on and on. Now, how about pharmaceuticals? This is a big, big problem. And, if you've followed Iran through the sanctions period, you know how big of a problem the lack of pharmaceuticals and advanced medical devices and things like that. The lack of these things is going to kill people. It's going to cost lives. It's going to lead somebody who would have survived their cancer to not survive it, or somebody who would have survived some traumatic injury that doesn't survive because of a lack of basic necessities. Uh, and the point here is that it's not just the lack of medicines or the lack of the tools, it's the lack of people that can develop alternatives, right? You need somebody to be able to build the medical tool that you could then manufacture yourself, but somebody got to do it. And if you don't have the experts, because for the last 35 years you've just been importing all of this stuff, and those guys and girls don't exist anymore, what are you supposed to do? Russia is stuck, and I think they know it. Now, the Russian government, I saw, oh my God, it's 18 minutes. Okay, I got to finish here. The Russian government I saw is pushing people, this was just reported today, pushing people in Russia to buy gold. Now, think very carefully about what that means. If you're a Russian citizen and you have cash and you turn it into gold, what are you supposed to do with that gold? You can't exchange it for dollars. You don't have access to the dollar right now because of the sanctions and everything else. You can't just go and turn it into something else. In other words, you're being given a worthless amount of gold. It's not exactly worthless, but it's worthless to you because you can't go buy bread with it or whatever it might be, right? So now here's the question. Why? Why is the Russian government pushing the citizens to buy gold? The answer is very, very, very simple: because they need cash. The Russian government needs cash. It does not have access to the cash that it thought it was going to have, or at least all the cash that it thought it was going to have. And it needs to have cash in order to keep things moving, to keep things running. Okay, so it's going to essentially raise the cash off the backs of Russian people. That essentially Russian citizens using their savings are more or less bailing out the government because the government blundered into a global economic disaster. This is the reality, and people in Russia are scared They are very, very, very scared. I saw reports. I can't confirm them because I'm not there, but I did see reports of people, cramming onto the high speed trains to make it their way to Finland as quickly as possible. Makes a lot of sense to me. I wouldn't wait around to see if Putin imposes martial law or shuts down the borders or reverts to the Soviet security state apparatus kind of thing. I wouldn't stick around either, quite frankly. And this is a huge, huge, huge problem for the Russians. And it's not entirely clear how exactly they're planning on addressing it. Yes, of course, I've talked about it now for a week. Capital flight is very real, but it's not just capital flight. Human flight is going to be a big problem. People are simply going to leave, and as long as they can, quite frankly. So anyway, there's so much more to talk about with regard to the economics. I have like 3 more pages of notes that I would probably be able to talk to, but don't have time for all of that. The last thing I will say, we should be clear. I think Nicolas Maduro, president of Venezuela, said it after his phone call with Putin. He described what's happening and what's been happening to Venezuela as economic warfare. And he said that economic war is the primary method of war of the empire. And he's right. He is right in a lot of ways. Venezuela's economy has collapsed over the years for a variety of reasons. Corruption and mismanagement are part of it, but sanctions and economic war are definitely a part of that. And so now economic war comes to Russia, and it's not clear if Russia can survive, at least not the Russian government. I'll have to leave it there. Go to the Patreon. I'm going to talk a little bit more about nuclear plants. I'm going to talk about humanitarian corridors and negotiation. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about a debate that I was invited to and the absolute stupidity of 99% of the people who talk about these issues. So go over to the Patreon if you want to hear more. I will leave it there. Talk to you again real soon.